can generate electricity, hydroelectricity, so that people can park their cars at the new station, leave them on charge, and use public transport to head down to Cardiff, and more importantly, perhaps people who've established businesses on the site can use the transport from the city to come up into the valleys. And that's another point I'll return to in a minute. One of the things that really influenced me was the report by Ellen Hazelcorn from Dublin University. And Hazelcorn did a review of higher education in Wales. And for Ellen Hazelcorn, there's a disconnect between the cultural and economic needs of many of the communities in South Wales and beyond. And universities were really seen as kind of islands of plenty, these well-manicured islands of plenty, that really were distant from their immediate locality, if you like. So Cardiff Metropolitan University, for example, sits right next to a large housing estate called Llanedrin, and it's got a very high correlation with indicators of social deprivation in the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, and very few people from the community come into the university. So, for example, we run lots of sports programs in the evening for young people, but the cost is beyond many of the households who live literally over the road from the university. So that's one example of this institutional disconnect. And again, one of the issues that we're trying to overcome is that of silos within higher education institutions. So until the advent of new legislation by Welsh Government, which is really pushing HEIs to have a greater engagement with their communities via civic engagement, then there's been relatively little collaboration by higher education institutions and regeneration organizations in their hinterland. And I ran a conference a couple of years ago focusing on community university partnerships. And one of the comments by a well-known community activist in Cardiff, a gentleman by the name of Alan Herbert, was that Cardiff University and Cardiff Prison had all had one thing in common, in that we had a big presence in the city, but it was really difficult to try and talk to anyone on the inside. So there's a need for greater engagement. And often, in my experience, although there are some extremely effective community organizations, many of them, particularly outside of the cities, tend to peak in terms of capacity and skills. So people in these communities, in these organizations, will know what the issues are, and this is where the university can learn from people in the community. But they lack the capacity to take strategies forward to ameliorate some of the issues that they're faced with. Very often people in regeneration organizations won't know much about what higher education institutions do. Some will. So, for example, in the west of Cardiff, there's an organization called Advanced Caira and Ely, but they benefit from a very high level of engagement with Cardiff University. So they have academics from the university as active members of the group. Not the case in many other groups. And one of the questions I ask my students in the third year, and bear in mind that most of my students are young, probably 98% of them are 18-year-olds when they come into university. And the question I ask in the third year is, you're going to graduate soon, will you go home? And very often, people who've come from the most marginalized communities say, no, I'm not going back because there is nothing there for me. Culturally, they've changed, they've distanced from their home environments, and they're distanced from the people they were friendly with, and there aren't the employment opportunities at a graduate level for them to access in their community. Teaching is an exception, but by and large, the higher paid jobs tend to be in areas like Swansea, Cardiff and Newport. So we draw young people out to the valleys and they don't go back. We've had long-term strategies such as Communities First, which has now ended. It was a 15-year strategy, which I feel needed upgrading and should have been renewed, but the funding was withdrawn. And due to, I think, a lack of skills and capacity in many of the Communities First groups, then it ranged in Cardiff. It was very successful. In other areas, not so. It made very limited impact. And we have problems, I mentioned in the discussion earlier on, entrenched problems that have lasted for 30 years. We now have 30% of children and 27% of adults in Wales living on or below the poverty line. And the majority of households that are in poverty actually have one person or more in employment. And for a lot of people now, we've gone from semi-skilled, relatively secure, well-paid employment to things like 0-hour minimum wage contracts, which do little for individual or social stability. So the basis really that we're drawing upon was that of systems theory, that we look at issues of integration and looking at problems holistically, and not a process of reduction where we focus on one problem, but treating all the issues that are identified by people in the community as an holistic entity, if you like, and then working in the process of co-production to develop responses to develop collective impact. So, as I've said, the idea was to establish a platform to promote flagship co-production in a community hub where people in that community could not only learn, but people from community-based organizations could meet with people from institutions like the local authority, like the higher education institutions, and work together to discuss and resolve problems. So the idea was to create an umbrella organization that acted as a magnet to draw other organizations together and develop economies of scale. So these are some of the achievements then. We've had, up until the advent of COVID, we've had a lot of student engagement. And the idea for me was to establish what I term a virtuous circle, that people who would not normally get exposed to contact with higher education institutions in communities can do so. It could enable research-led teaching, and it could enable teaching that actually benefits communities to a greater degree than at present, and again establishes a process of service learning where students become more skilled in terms of hitting the ground running as they enter the labour market, which is one of the key indicators that all governments are looking at now. So these are the successes. Actually, one of the students published an oral history project. We've had dance students who've worked with local school children to turn the oral history project into performance. So there have been some successes. So initially then we started out as a multidisciplinary team, and I've already talked about the range of student projects, but we had design specialists, tourism specialists, a conservation architect who wanted to take forward the idea of a heritage skills academy. But then after a couple of years, things began to deteriorate. I was given something like 70 hours an academic year to work on the project, but there was no financial backing and all other staff were engaged on a voluntary basis. And so a process of attrition set in. John Council, the conservation architect, retired. Workload increased for other members of staff, and they had to prioritize that. And as other funded projects came on board, then people's attention was diverted into those. So activity began to stall. And then, out of the blue, I had a phone call from a gentleman I'd never met before or heard of, called Neville Southall. And Neville Southall phoned me up and said, I'm working in a pupil referral unit, and I've heard about the work you're trying to do at Crumlin in terms of restoring the bridges. Can I come, the buildings rather, can I come down and talk to you? So Neville Southall duly came in, and as we were walking through the corridor for lunch, I couldn't understand why lots of people were taking photographs and asking for autographs. And then one of my colleagues informed me that Neville Southall was actually the most capped Welsh footballer of all time, and played for Wales in goal and for Everton with quite a long and prestigious football career. So it was a sharp learning curve for myself. So this took the project in a new direction. And one of the ideas we've discussed is that we're working with children, young people from pupil referral units. They're school excluded. They come with a variety of issues that range from mental health problems to being convicted criminals. And if these people leave the pupil referral unit at 16, they have limited employment prospects, and they have a high risk of further or criminality or becoming engaged in criminality. So, ending up in a vicious circle, really. So this took the project in a new direction, and based on the idea that many of these young people will have very strong vocational skills, then we are working with ARC, which is a construction training company, to use the buildings as a live project whereby the young offenders actually see themselves as stakeholders in achieving a permanent impact by their input into restoring the buildings. And one of the plans we were about to put in place was to use people leaving the military who are entitled to quite substantive work-based placements prior to leaving with pay as mentors. So the idea is that the service leavers would mentor 3 to 4 young people over the age of 14. They would have vocational skills that they could transfer, but they would also have the skills to say to these young people, I will be there for you as your mentor, but if you mess with me, you will come off second best. Because a lot of these young people are looking for boundaries. Unfortunately, then COVID came along, so everything's on hold. But as we move out of COVID, we find ourselves in a new policy environment. We have the Wales-wide Civic Mission Network, which Welsh Government have set up, and it enables universities and instructs universities to prioritise civic mission projects and the support that universities can give to their surrounding communities. So Cardiff Metropolitan University, one of the more recent responses launched at the end of July is a global academy with a focus on resilient places and resilient people. So hopefully policy is moving in the right direction. So we're regrouping, we're rebuilding. So I'm in the process of building a new internal team with IT specialists, people with an interest in hydroelectric generation, as well as people from our new School of Technology who are interested in the possibilities that the Crumlin site provides. Carolyn Strong has made a really valuable contribution by joining the team recently from Cardiff University. So this helps us to build critical mass. Again, Carolyn has worked to develop live student projects. Carolyn is from the School of Management in Cardiff Business and Management in Cardiff University, so brings a whole new range of expertise. And Carolyn actually put together a Cardiff University project bid, and we've actually reached the second round of scrutiny for potential £7,500 funding. Now, what we propose to do with that is to provide additional opportunities initially for the pupil referral unit students to set up a polytunnel project whereby the young people can grow things like tomatoes and peppers, produce that will grow quickly so that they see a result quickly. And this could be sold in the local community via a social enterprise. So we also give the young people opportunities in business. And bringing the presentation to a close, one of my students who's just left our postgraduate certificate in post-compulsory education and training has landed a job with Coleg Gwent, which is about 4 miles down the road from Crumlin. And her role is to build partnerships with the community and other organizations. So now we're working to look at a bridging qualification or a bridging course whereby the young people can gain initial experience in vocational skills in Crumlin via the and with elements of the 14 to 19 curriculum, and then use that experience to encourage the young people to join a course which will begin on site in Crumlin, but will end with them taking part in study in the local further education college. So hopefully getting these young people to realize the potential that they actually have, and to provide them with a learning journey.
Thank you very much, Tim.